for over 3 months. If this is something that is COVID specific.
I have a partial answer for what you're experiencing. So, for context, this is an individual that has had persistent COVID symptoms for 3 months and has been testing positive for COVID in that time. The new term for this is persistent COVID, which is to define an acute infection, a continuous ongoing infection for greater than 60 days. And this is the paper that I'm going to go through that documents this and talks about this, where the authors are interested in this because they believe that persistent infections of COVID might act as viral reservoirs and give seed to mutated lineages of COVID, in addition to contributing to cases of long COVID in the population. So in this study, they identified 381 people with COVID that had been persisting for at least 30 days, and 54 of those had viral RNA persisting for at least 60 days, which is referred to as persistent infections, where individuals with persistent infection had a 50% higher odds of self-reporting long COVID than individuals with non-persistent infections, where this study uses data from the National Statistics COVID Infection Survey, which is a large-scale community-based surveillance study carried out in the UK, where they have provided several lines of evidence suggesting that these individuals are persistently infected with replicating virus, and this henceforth should be referred to as persistent infections of COVID. Interestingly, these long-term infections were not necessarily lineage specific. However, the highest prevalence was in Delta and then BA2, where the authors estimate that 1 in 1,000 of all infections, or maybe even as high as 1 in 200 infections, may become persistent, with intermittently high viral loads for at least 2 months, where this may then explain the early detection of cryptic lineages circulating in wastewater, which could be a result of these persistent infections. Now, the reason why the 60-day cutoff is so important is that there's not a lot of nucleotide mutation within host until that 60-day period, and after that, about 41% of the samples gained a high degree of mutational adaptation to the host, meaning that COVID is more likely to mutate when it is persisting longer than the 2-month period. So what's really interesting about this study is that because they're looking at the genetic sequencing of COVID itself, they're able to detect if a person is reinfected or has a persistent infection of the same thing, which means this is the first good study that has shown that there is in fact rebounding viral load that can occur or chronic viral load that can occur, but in both cases you can go from a high to a low level. It's just in the chronic persistent infection, you're not going to zero, you're going slightly better and then getting worse again, while with the rebounding viral load you can go to a non-detection state and then go back up, which is likely what your scenario is. If this is a persistent infection, what you were infected with has likely undergone various mutations, where these mutations would then be very likely to increase the fitness of COVID that you were infected with itself, meaning that it would be very important for you to continue wearing a mask despite it being so long after your initial infection, because you need to protect everyone else around you. Now, moving back to the larger context of why this is very interesting. In their persistently infected individuals, there were 277 unique mutations and 31 deletions, representing 18 unique deletions, where many of mutations identified in these persistently infected individuals have previously been identified as lineage-defining mutations for variants of concern or even variants of interest. So these are bad mutations. These are ones that increase the fitness of COVID, which would make it bad for the population, meaning that there's a second population of individuals, not just immunocompromised individuals who have been largely targeted for the existence of these emerging lineages, but it's the long-term persistent infections that can cause these as well. And the thing is, anybody can have a persistent infection. The additional knowledge of this paper is that it really dives into the difference between persistent infections that rebound and then also reinfections, where this persistent rebounding of the viral load dynamics occurred in about 30% of the cases. And without the genetic information, they could have been misidentified as reinfections. So now that we have this evidence, I can learn that I was wrong about rebound infections with the same thing. I believe them to be purely reinfections with different variants. So I thought the reinfection was the person getting sick with COVID again from a different variant. But this is now our first good evidence of a rebound infection of the same thing, a persistent rebound infection. But what is more interesting is that in 82% of the persistent infection cases, they had this sort of roller coaster effect where it would go up and down regardless of if it was going to zero or just slightly down and then back up again. And the scary thing is that by and large, individuals with persistent infections remained largely asymptomatic during the later stages of their infection, where the nuance here is that people that got reinfected, so this is you got over an infection, you got a new infection, those people reported more symptoms at the last sampling than those who had persistent infections, where they had more of maintained symptoms, which is then evidence for that stacking effect, where you get each reinfection and you're going to feel worse each time. And because of this intermittent viral oscillation, it suggests that the mechanism of persistent infection is not due to delayed clearance of the virus by the host, but points to the possible prevalence of or presence of actively replicating virus in the body. My guess this means that individuals would have to go on things like Paxlovid to try to suppress that active viral replication, but I haven't seen anything outside of this study that has looked to address this.